Hi! In my previous response I covered points where Matthewmatosis had a point. This video is the opposite.
But insanely unfair for melee characters since there's no safe time to attack them. The mace-wielding knights in the dragon area are perhaps the worst enemies in the entire series thanks to how stupidly unfair their moveset is. They seem to just reset their animations constantly without any kind of stamina. Even after dropping their mace on the ground, they have no recovery time before they're swinging all over the place again.
There are two factors here that made it harder for him. First reason is that this Drakekeeper really does not like shields. He will relentlessly bash against the shield until your posture breaks. Pay attention!
Trivial for a magic-wielding character, but insanely unfair for melee characters since there's no safe time to attack them.
Whenever he breaks your stance, he takes a few steps back to give you a moment to breathe. So even though he does not like shields, I would still argue that this behavior is pretty fair, especially as there are too few enemies that punish excessive shield usage. There is a longer pause between his attacks if you do not try to block with a shield. These enemies force you to fight them honorful, without resorting to summons or shields. But there is another important factor at play. He joined the hard mode covenant. A lot of his complaints about difficulties seem to be tainted by being in the company of champions.
Did you see that oddly formed rock behind here? Long ago they called it Victor's Stone, as I recall. If you wish to face greater challenges, speak to the rock.
Take the company of champions, for example. The player walks up to a big stone tablet and is immediately prompted to join the Covenant without any explanation. This could have easily had some text on the tablet explaining what the Covenant was about. Instead, you only get a vague description after you accept the first prompt. I go into the Souls games knowing as little about them as possible, which I definitely feel is the way they should be played. So for all I knew, I might suffer some harsh penalty for abandoning this Covenant, which meant it would be foolish for me to join it without having more information.
The extra damage you receive while being a member of this covenant really does make a difference, especially as you also need more hits to defeat enemies.
A good comparison is the Royal Rat Authority in Sif. The fight with the Royal Rat Authority is much more difficult, but Sif is far more memorable. Difficulty doesn't necessarily equate to a good experience even in a Souls game.
Here we see him once again complain about difficulty, while being in the hard mode covenant. But he does have a bit of a point, as FromSoft acknowledged that this fight was a bit too hard, by reducing the amount of damage this giant rat dog deals in the improved Scholar of the First Sin edition. Also, pay attention to how easily I deal with the dogs by using a +6 Hunter's Black Bow. The nerf does not look as apparent as the one the Ancient Dragon received, but it's still 30% less damage. But I still think he misunderstood the fight as just being difficult for the sake of being difficult.
One of the first images that pops into my mind when I think of Dark Souls is a giant, proud-looking wolf wielding an enormous sword while protecting the grave of his master. The Royal Rat Authority, on the other hand, is a retread of the Sif fight with 4 random enemies which inflict toxin slapped in front of it to make it harder.
There is a visual parallel between 2 giant dogs, but I would draw the comparison to Capra Demon, who also has smaller dogs in his arena that are meant to make it harder. But the difference is that the Royal Rat Authority gives you time to assess the situation, while the Capra Demon just ganks up on you with his 2 dogs. You are meant to die the first time you enter Capra Demon, but you are meant to teleport back out for the Royal Rat Authority to grab a good bow. It's a fairer re-implementation of the dog gank.
If you manage to kill the 4 rats, the fight is practically over, but unless you're a pyromancer, it's a crapshoot about whether you'll manage to get them all before the giant one mauls you to death.
While he is right that it is possible to deal with them as a pyromancer, I disagree that it is hard to deal with them otherwise. In fact, I would argue that his bow build would be even easier. He was using poison arrows against poison-themed enemies, which is never a good idea. If you can one-shot them, it's really not hard to defeat them before the boss joins. But even just using melee isn't all too hard. To me, this fight is more of a gimmick fight, where you have to find a way how to deal with the 4 weak enemies quickly. It's less about difficulty, and more about getting the player to think about how they approach the situation. But I guess the hard mode Covenant made it feel worse to him.
Similar problems extend to other boss fights, which seem to follow the mantra, if you can't make it good, make it difficult by adding more stuff. In Dark Souls 2, the number of bosses with multiple enemies jumps to 11, 12 if we include Dark Lurker, most of which feel as lazily designed as the Capra Demon encounter.
I like how he used the Prowling Magus as an example for difficult boss fights. To me, that fight felt very similar to the Channeler encounter in the Duke's Archive. The major difference is that the Congregation have a fog wall and boss health bar, but as they do not drop a boss soul, I would categorize them as a mini-boss. In both of these encounters, your main focus is a strong mage that is supported by both ranged and melee enemies. The point of such encounters is not difficulty, but adding variety to the flow of battles by having you utilize different strategies for different scenarios. It's more interesting than only having 1 versus 1 fights.
The mechanics of the Souls games are built for one-on-one engagements, thanks to its slow attack animations which are uninterruptible once they start, and a lock-on camera which focuses heavily on a single foe.
As we've seen here in the introduction sequence of Demon Souls, the Souls games have never primarily focused on one-on-one engagements. Mechanics like horizontal attacks, AoE spells, or alluring skulls exist to take care of groups of enemies, and you've always had to be able to handle multiple enemies at the same time, while trying not to attract the attention of even more. I've been replaying Demon Souls a bit, and so far the vast majority of enemy encounters are against groups of enemies. I just feel like his argument is based on a misunderstanding of what the Souls games are about. These games throw you in situations that feel hard the first time you experience them, but can be handled easily if you adapt by changing how you approach them or what tools you use, and multi-enemy encounters have always been part of that formula. Both Demon Souls and DS1 started with a lot of multi-enemy encounters, as they want to teach the player how to handle these kinds of fights from the very beginning. I will not go deep into the next point, but why was he still relying on the lock-on mechanic even though both previous games already taught him not to do this if he wants to keep an eye on the ranged enemy? This encounter is a good example of this. It's right at the beginning of the game, and teaches you not to use the lock-on while fighting multiple enemies. So I don't understand why he thinks that the mechanics of these games are built for one-on-one engagements, especially as these games provide you with so many different ways of approaching multi-enemy encounters.
The mechanics of the Souls games are built for one-on-one engagements. There's no way to know this beam in the well will break if you land on it, especially unexpected since landing safely on stuff like this was possible in Demon Souls.
Demon Souls is a game where you regularly had to worry about boards collapsing. Nice! There is an item, let me walk over to see what it is. And that's how quickly you can permanently lose access to the Great Club. Also, this beam never looked safe to me. There are stable-looking platforms made out of 4 beams, and then some that are just 1 beam thick and look sketchy on first glance.
Dark Souls 2 doesn't seem to have as much trust in the player.
This is like the most obvious death trap in the Souls series.
But there's less care taken to ensure each death is the fault of the player. This door in Aldia's Keep has no indication it's about to kill you either. This moment would be incredibly cheap in any game, but it's especially disheartening to see it in a Souls game which used to be known for being punishing, but fair.
2 doors before that one, there was already an obvious ogre that jumped through the door. He should have already been scared while opening the second door. I remember hitting it on my first playthrough to make sure that there's nothing behind it. Did you notice how he did not pick up the item before opening the door? This moment is literally just punishment for rushing, while it also teaches that you could utilize the ogres to break open this door. Hidden secrets like this are exactly what make DS2 great, but to him it was just a bad experience that would not have happened if he had just picked up the item.
Another comparison is the Tower Knight and the Last Giant, which are night and day compared to one another. For the Tower Knight, the arena is incredibly spacious, and players are lured up to deal with the archers first, giving them time and space to learn the Tower Knight's attacks before having to deal with him directly.
Do you see the fog wall at the end of the bridge? That's where the Tower Knight is. Did you notice the burning bodies on the ground? That's how this game indicates that you are about to get burned by a dragon. The path to the Tower Knight is tedious, as you either have to slowly get across the bridge or run down below it. This next point does not apply to him, but people that complain about DS2 runbacks clearly have never played Demon Souls. This game really does not want to let you run through. And there's just so many archers everywhere. And once you are in, there are like 10 archers all around you that you need to take care of first. The main point I'm trying to get at is that there is a lot more artificial difficulty and that there are a lot more cheap deaths on the path to the Tower Knight and during his fight than the easy Last Giant has.
For the Last Giant, there's no such prep time, the arena is far more cramped, and his moveset consists of haphazard flailing which can catch you the wrong way for seemingly no reason. The Tower Knight fight is about as challenging as the Last Giant, the only difference being you're less likely to suffer a cheap death the first time you face him.
He really makes it seem as if the Last Giant is not one of the easiest bosses in the series. Also, calling his arena crammed is just such a weird complaint as you always have plenty of space to fight him.
It feels to me like difficulty was a big focus in Dark Souls 2, which is a crucial misunderstanding on the part of the new directors of this game.
I feel like he misunderstood the difficulty by having played most of it in the hard mode Covenant, and ignoring all the ways in which it got easier.
It seems to me like they didn't understand the significance of healing in Dark Souls, in which case they should never have been placed in charge of this game. Dark Souls 2 adds in consumable healing items and a regeneration ring placed in a prominent location early on, which can be easily equipped on any build since there's 2 additional ring slots.
More healing opportunities is one of the ways in which they deliberately turned down the difficulty in order to make exploring an area less frustrating, as you do not need to worry about running out of healing options as much. I really don't see how DS2 was trying more to be hard than the other Souls games.
One of the greatest things about Dark Souls 1 compared to Demon Souls was its careful bonfire placement, which engaged the player in a game of risk versus reward. If you got far into a new area, you could usually make your way back to the previous bonfire easily to use your souls for leveling up, but that would waste more time than pressing onwards, so you were left with a dilemma: push yourself to go on, or go back and play it safe.
Throughout this video I completely changed the order of his arguments, but I felt like it helps to highlight that his complaints about difficulty are based on a few bad experiences that mostly happened while he was playing in the hard mode Covenant, that also made him see all the ways in which the game deliberately became more approachable and easier in a negative light as well, instead of realizing that the game wasn't designed to be hard just for the sake of being hard. The existence of the hard mode Covenant also shows that the intentions of the developers was to provide optional difficulty for players that want to experience a challenging game. The key word here is optional, as players can opt into the hard mode and opt out of shields, magic, life gems, summons, or leveling ADP. If you want to make this game easy, there are plenty of ways to do so, but also if you want to make it hard. The design is clearly to appeal to a broader spectrum of players, but not to just make a difficult game. They made it so much less cryptic and less frustrating by adding a lot more checkpoints and ways to handle encounters.
That same feeling is hard to reclaim in Dark Souls 2 when all the bonfires are so close to one another. The Lost Bastille, one of the only complexly woven levels in Dark Souls 2, has 5 bonfires, 6 if we include Sinner's Rise, whereas places like the Painted World and Undead Burg only had 1 each. Not only this, but the way health in general is handled in Dark Souls 2 removes even more of the tension from the first game.
I would just like to repeat that I find it somewhat funny how he simultaneously complains that the developers were trying too much to make a difficult game, while also complaining about the addition of life gems, a ring that heals you, and more bonfires that all make the game less difficult. Which leads me to the next factor that makes the game less frustrating.
In the previous Souls games, part of the challenge sometimes was getting back to a boss after failing to kill them. If the level didn't open a shortcut or there wasn't a nearby bonfire, you had to traverse the level again and then make it to the boss in good enough condition to kill it. This was one of the things that drew people to the series in the first place, because it was challenging but still very fair. Now look at this path to Velstalt in Dark Souls 2. It's a single corridor littered with no less than 7 heavily armoured enemies. There's no sense of progress slowly making your way down a corridor by fighting the same enemy 7 times, so you're far more likely to just run through it.
It feels really weird to see someone being nostalgic for the Demon Souls runbacks. If you think that DS2 is hard and long runbacks, you really have to play Demon Souls to see just how much more frustrating it could have been. I guess we can all agree that shorter and easier runbacks are not a bad thing.
This isn't level design, it's tedious, lazy, and frustrating.
I needed a couple of tries for the old hero runback that is playing in the background. It took me over 2.5 minutes, which is about the same as Lud and Zalin, but if you were to fight your way through like he suggested, it will take much longer. It's also funny how he complains that you have to fight the same enemy several times in DS2, but apparently has no problem with runbacks where you fight the same enemies more often, as the runbacks in Demon Souls were generally longer and stuffed with enemies that really did not want to let you through easily. So, all in all, I just have to disagree with the vast majority of his complaints about difficulty.
There's less care taken to ensure each death is the fault of the player. For example, there's no way to know this door in Huntsman's Copse will get you attacked if you try to open it,